Welcome to the Lightforge. This is ADWCTA.
This is Merps, and we are entering the final week of the expansion. There was a lot of hype leading up to
It's,
it,
it's so
and
good. We've been doing this for so long that we've forgotten basic things like how to start a podcast properly.
yes, it is a good thing all of you out there are listening to this and
To
not
the
listening to all the failed attempts that we have
yeah,
had.
the fully edited version where everything will go smoothly. Let's just jump right in this week. I know we normally do like a meta recap or something, but the Wing 3 meta is going to last for like a week, and there's no real need to recap it. It's pretty much the Wing 2 meta. Not all that much has changed, so let's just get right to it, and
Sounds
let's
good.
talk about what you want to hear, which is Wing 4 cards. It's coming out, and it's coming out on Thursday, and with Wing 4 is going to be just the end. League of Explorers is going to be done,
Yeah,
and and we're going to have all the cards, and all of a sudden, and this is very important, and we say it every single podcast that we have been previewing League of Explorers. The 25% offering bonus for League of Explorers is going to kick in at the start of Wing 4, which means all of the League of Explorers cards that have come out before now will also all of a sudden be seen 25% more often in your drafts.
yeah, and that would change the game in a whole new way. Basically, what made the Paladin so hated in TGT was partly because of the increased offering rates of two of the best cards in the game, Murloc Knight and Seal of Champions. And although I don't think we'll see anything that crazy here, you guys have already been annoyed by how powerful Ethereal Conjurer is in the arena, right? Well, now may just get more Ethereal Conjurers. So we have uh, that to look forward to. There'll be more Keeper of Old Demands, and by the same token, there'll be less AOEs because unless you're a huge fan of Excavated Evil, there will be less AOE. So we're going to go back to that same dynamic as TGT. But for now, we have a very free flowing, changing meta that is a lot of fun to play.
Yeah, yeah. So with Wing 4 coming, those are the two parts that we're going to focus on. And we'll talk more about the offering bonus and how it affects things in a bit. But for now, let's focus on the actual card previews, which is important. Because those are the new cards, and you want to know how good they
Sounds
are.
good.
And well, I remember from Wing 3 when we previewed a bunch of cards, and the end consensus is pretty much like they're not that good. Like, Pit Snake aside, I think we were all like, on all the cards. And I think you're going to get a fairly similar rundown on these cards. These are not, like, they're not terribly exciting cards for Constructed, and they're exciting for the arena only because you're going to have to pick some of them, but they're not, there's no Keeper of Oldemons here, you know? There's no, I don't even know if there's a Pit Snake here. There's no the good cards, the warrior cards, the fierce monkeys, and the obsidian destroyers, and the keeper of Voldemons. They're all out already. So
Yeah.
it's a little more on the average-ish cards that are coming out in this wing. But like I said, that doesn't mean that the meta is not going to shift in the most pronounced way since Wing 1 came out. Because the meta shifted when Wing 1 came out, when the TGT bonus went away. And it's going to shift again now because the LOE bonus is going to kick in, not just because of these cards we're going to review. But let's go through the cards.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so which one are we doing first?
We're going to start with Fossilized Devilsaur, which is a 8 mana 8/8 neutral common card. And it has a battle cry that says if you control a beast, gain taunt.
So it is a conditional Ironbark Protector for all classes,
Yup.
basically. And
Yup.
all right, so I guess I'll tackle this first. Conditional Ironbark. Talking about Ironbark in general, so we know that it is a specific Druid class card, but Ironbark Protector has gotten better, mostly just because of the slightly slower metagame once we went from GVG to TGT. In the GVG meta, Ironbark Protector was much lower on our tier score for basically the reason just because a lot of times when you put it out there, one person would be winning by a lot on turn 8 anyways, and you didn't want to put something out there that didn't have an immediate effect, and they could basically counterplay, and you would just lose the game right there. Now, big minions, especially big minions with taunt, have a little bit more value in this sort of slower metagame. The problem is, with the Fossilized Devil Sword, you need to control a beast to gain taunt, and unless you're a hunter or a druid, you don't have that many access to beasts, and neutral beasts are not that great. We do see a bit more beasts in the arena for all classes just because of Tomb Spider, which is a pretty good card. It's an above average card. But at the same time, I don't know the exact percentages, but most of the time you're just dropping 8 mana 8/8, and that's not great, right?
Yeah, I mean, the comparison that I like to make is actually not with an Ironbark Protector, because I don't think it's going to be an Ironbark Protector all that often.
Yeah.
Because if it was, it's pretty good, right? Ironbark Protector is better than a Yeti, the way we rate it since TGT came out. And like you said, it was such a big difference, right?
Yes.
It used to be auto pick, right? Unless you have like
Yes.
3 of them, you auto picked it. And then GVG came out, and it was like, oh wow, I don't get to play this card. I'm just dead when I get to play this card.
Right.
And so its value dropped a lot. And then TGT came out, and all of a sudden, with all the Inspire mechanics and everything slowing down, and Kraken's being like a legit card, your 8/8 Ironbark Protectors all of a sudden became really useful again. So here, it's not the case. The Ironbark Protector only had that much value because of the taunt. When you don't have a taunt, you don't have any way to affect the board. Your opponent, whenever you drop a really big minion, like why is, think of Force Tank Max. That's an insane card. It is 7/7 with a Divine Shield, so it'll kill at least 2 big things, if not 3 big things. That's Kraken levels of good.
Yeah.
But it's not rated all that highly. I think we rated it 60 or something around there. And that's because it has no immediate impact on the board. At least with the taunt, you get that immediate tempo shift on the board where your opponent has to deal with it. But when you don't, you drop a big minion, and no one is removing, like unless someone has a polymorph or something, no one's removing that Force Tank Max. They're going face. And you're dying after that, most likely. So
Yep.
Fossilized Devil Sword has that downside without the real upside, because it's an 8/8 for 8. So it's really more like a War Golem, which is rated at 50, except it's even worse because you're committing even more resources into one body, and that 8 health doesn't really matter all that much compared to the 7 health, and the 8 damage doesn't really matter all that much compared to the 7 damage. So it's just kind of a worse card than War Golem, which is not a great card to begin with. So that's the comparison I make, and it's just, you're not going to see it very often, and it's not going to be good when you play it or when you face it.
Right. It's so the analysis is kind of, even if it hits, you're not getting a super duper premium card, right? You're getting a very good card when it hits, but most of the time it won't hit, even though we do see more neutral beasts recently with Tomb Spider and Huge Toad. So bottom line, this card is just not that great, and if you are putting down a heavy card that has no impact and no extra value, that's not a good card. Would you rather have an 8 mana 8/8 or a 4 mana 4/4? You'd rather have the card that you can actually play in the early turns that can help you before you just die by turn 8.
Alright, so I think that's enough on the Fossilized Devil Sword. In case anyone was excited by it, I hope you're no longer excited. This is our goal. Destroy all excitement about Wing 4.
There you go.
Do we have another common neutral coming out? I don't even think... No, we don't even have another common neutral coming out. That was the only common neutral in Wing 4. Now we have a couple of rare neutral cards. See? Such low impact. The one common neutral that's left to be released is not that good of a card.
Yeah.
So Wobbling Runts is a 6 mana 2/6. It's a neutral rare. 6 mana for a 2/6. For the record, a Oasis Snapdraw, not that great of a 4-drop, is 4 mana for a 2/7. So Wobbling Runs is 2 mana overcosted and has 1 less health than Oasis Snapdraw. Now it's supposed to make up for it with its ability, which is Death Rattle. Summon 3 2/2 runts. So that gets you 6/6 of tempo on the board, which is really pretty nice, right? Like 6 mana for 6/6 worth of tempo, that's almost normal. But overall, And if you add it together with the actual 2/6 body, what you're getting is something like a 8/12 worth of stats for 6 mana. That's insane. And I think it's easy for people to look at it and say, well, look, this is ridiculously insane. It's got to be a really great card. And I don't think it's that great of a card. Despite just a huge amount of stats that this card will eventually get you. And I don't think it's that good because no one's going to kill it. Yeah. It's a 2/6. How many things have 6 attack or more? Very few. Even the Pit Fighter only has 5 attack. So what it really is, it's a card that eats up 2.5 of your mana for a really long time. At least 2 turns, while you hit it into one of your opponent's things, and then you hit it into one of your opponent's things like after that, before you can get your 2/2s out on the board. And the time investment for these 3 2/2 runs is just very significant that you're not going to get that out there. And in the arena, how often do you really get to spend 6 mana to put something down on the board that you're not going to be able to do anything with, right? Like, that's why Void Caller kind of has the same effect, but we treat it as generally a good card because it only has 4 health. This card has 6 health. And so it is 50% harder to kill off than a Void Caller. And so, do the math there. And it also costs 2 more mana than a Void Caller.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing about wobbling runs, first of all, I'll say, I think the card design for something like this is really good. Whenever I look at a card and I get a little bit perplexed and I'm not exactly sure how I think about it. And the more I think about it, I'm just like, wow, this is a well-designed card. I'm not saying it's a good card, but it is a well-designed card in which, so you have 6 mana for a 2/6, you summon 3 2/2s, and like ADWCTA says, you can think of it as, it's overstated. And unlike a Cairn, in which you think of it as basically a 4/10, because you only get, at one time on the board, you only get 4 attack, right? The initial body is 4 attack. The Death Rattle body of the Cairn also only has 4 attack. With this one, it's different. It's a very slow card that speeds up after the Death Rattle. So you can't think of it as just a 2/12 or something like that. It's different in that it's a very, very slow card at the beginning. You basically pay 2 mana more for a weaker Oasis Snapjaw, and suddenly it speeds up after the Death Rattle. You just get these 3/2 runs, and we haven't seen a card like this where you get this shift in the speed of the card, where very slow and then very fast afterwards. And they also made it pretty awkward to kill, difficult to kill. The initial impact.
I think you can argue about Sneeds. Sneeds being something similar to it, where the initial body is okay, but you really want to kill it off because the second body is where you get your payoff for.
Yeah, definitely. But the more I think about it, I'm like, this is a card that we haven't really seen before. And I think Sneeds is a very good comparison. But with Sneeds, you don't know what you're getting, right? With this, you plan for it. You can really say, okay, I'm going to drop this. I know what I'm going to get after it, and I can plan out for this kind of quick shift into these 3 2/2 bodies afterwards. So great card design. I do agree. I don't think it's a very good card. It's not a bad card by any means.
It's not a bad card. No. I just hated on it in the beginning because I think most people are going to see it and think it's a great card. But I definitely don't think it's a bad card. I think it may even be still a little bit above average. Just because if you think about it, right, it's still, you can't write off the fact that it's 8/12 worth of stats, right? Like, no matter what happens, that's kind of a ridiculous amount of stats to be getting. 8/12 worth of stats is like a 10/10, should be like 9.5 mana. This is only 6 mana. And just on the sheer card advantage, it's worth something.
Definitely.
And the fact that you can't just remove it, because what's one of the biggest dangers of putting out a Force Tank Max, it's that it gets polymorphed or it gets assassinated. Well, Wobbling Runs can still get polymorphed, but if it gets assassinated, you're still getting a good amount of value out of it. So it kind of splits the difference between the large removals. And that's really to its favor.
Yep. So great card design, and we'll
Hmm.
see how it shapes out in the arena.
Yeah.
I'm very certain that I will just be highly annoyed at this card many times in the arena.
Well, yeah, because this is why you're annoyed at void callers when they come down, right? You can't
Exactly.
remove it.
Yep.
Your entire strategy, if you're facing a wobbling runt, it shifts as soon as it comes out. Your opponent drops a wobbling runt, you're going face because you're not killing that thing unless you have like a consecration in hand or something that's like real convenient.
Right.
Um, and so if you're a warlock and your opponent shifts to your face, that's dangerous for you because your health is so valuable. But what if you're like a priest, right?
Yeah.
What if you're like, someone whose health really doesn't matter, like a hunter or something? Um, well, if you're especially if you're a priest, you can now buff it,
Yeah.
and then it becomes a really good buff target. It's a little slow, but you can heal yourself anyway. And if you're a hunter and they don't remove it, you're still getting 2 damage on their face every turn, which could be all you need.
Yeah. So we'll see. This is definitely a card that will be arena relevant. And that's kind of a
Yes.
good way of saying that you probably won't see it constructed. But hey, a lot of cards are arena relevant, right?
That's why Arena's so awesome. You get to use wobbling runts. And if you guys haven't seen it yet, the 2/2 runts that get created aren't like generic runts. They have their own art and their own names and all
Yes,
that.
I
They're like
love
special
that.
runts. Like
I'm
you
gonna
have
stop Wizard.
Rascally Runt, Wily Runt, and Grumbly Runt.
Perfect. And afterwards, you have the tough decision of which one do you send to their death, you know?
Yes, yes. Uh-huh.
Oh my gosh. Great card design by Blizzard, and also good. Just putting the runs as something different. A plus. Nice job, Blizz.
I can't wait to hear their voices actually.
Yeah, me too. It'll be a good time.
Okay, so Eerie Statute is the other rare common card that's going to get released in Wing 4, and this one is actually pretty worthless. This is not Wobbling Runs, you're not going to see it, it's not slightly above average, it is a 4 mana 7/7. Oh my god, so overstated.
I
And
know.
it has the message where it cannot attack unless it is the only minion in the battlefield.
Now, only minion in the battlefield, not just not just if your opponent doesn't have anything. It's if it is the only minion on the battlefield, period. So basically, unless you have a silence for this thing, it's not getting used. You have to silence it, you have to taunt it up or something. Otherwise, you
Otherwise, it could be
just
7 damage every turn if you control the board to your opponent.
you no, you have to control the board and clear your side as well.
Yeah, you have to control the board without minions.
Yeah, basically. You have to put it down and just keep on fireballing and frostbolting their minions and then go face for 7. So it's a very like niche kind of application with this card. And in the arena, you just can't. You'd have to get some pretty bad other cards in order to pick this one, or if you just happen to
Aggro
have.
control, man. Aggro control. You just gotta. If you can remove all your opponent's minions, this is 7 damage to your opponent's face, and they're not gonna want to remove it.
There you go. But
It
if you
really is
have,
the perfect aggro control card.
yeah, if you have Defender of Arguses, if you have Sun Furies, Owls, or Spellbreakers, this isn't a bad card at all, right?
Yep.
If but only if you have a lot of them.
Right. Just to give you an idea of how much value this card gets if you can silence it, a silence effect is typically valued at 1 mana. So if this were a 4/5, then that 1 mana of an effect would have gotten you 3/2 worth of stats, which is like 2.5.
Yeah.
So it's a very good silence target.
Yes, it is definitely a very good science target. As is, it's like this is a good science target. Fel Reaver is a great science target, but part of the reason Fel Reaver works is all it does is discard cards that don't matter, right?
Yeah.
And this can't attack unless you fulfill this incredibly hard, unless you do this thing in which is almost impossible to do in the arena. So,
Yeah, and you look at Ancient Watcher, just to go back to the analysis of the stat distribution. 2 mana, 4/5. It can't attack at all, right? It's even worse than this guy. But if you silence that card, you only get 2 mana's worth of stuff, and you use your 1 mana's worth of stuff for the silence effect. So your net gain is one, like, I will call it a tempo unit, whereas the Eerie Statue gets you 2.5. So very good silence target. Very good target to taunt up.
Yep.
And it's forces your opponent to play minions at least.
Also, this will be a potential nerf to piloted Sky Golem. Hmm? Think about it.
Oh, wow. Because Pilot Sky Golem was always one of the ones where you can't get screwed too badly, you know? You're going to get like a 2-5 at worst. Or like a 3-2.
There's some 3-3s. There's some 3-3s.
Yeah, it's 3-2s, right? It's the Enhanced Mechano. That's like kind of the worst you get.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Dreadsteed also, potentially, depending on whether you see that as worse or better. But now you add a Yuri statue. Oof, this is rough.
There you go. Okay.
Okay, so that's the two neutral cards, two neutral rares that are getting introduced. You can see why we're not like too excited about, although Wobbling Runs is going to be fun. The next card that I want to talk about, and I love this card. I'm just going to come out right out and say it. This is one of my favorite LOE cards that's coming out. And I hate Priest. It's a Priest common card. It is 2 mana. It is a 1/2, so it's not a 2-drop at all. But it has a battle cry that says, Discover a Death Rattle card. Now, if you remember, Novice Engineer used to be 2 mana 1/2, and it was considered outright broken OP.
Well, that was outright broken OP back then was much different than outright broken OP now.
Yeah, and it was outright broken OP not in Arena, but in Constructed, where you have a very well synergized deck, so you do want to burn through your deck in terms of drawing through it. Right. Museum Curator, they're able to do this because it's not drawing from your deck, so it's not OP broken in Constructed. They've managed to sidestep that issue, and it's still very good in Arena. And why I think this is incredibly good in the Arena is because Death Rattle cards are so good.
Yes.
Like, if you just look through the Death Rattle cards, there's a whole crap ton of legendaries. You have your Karens, you have your Sneeds, you have, like, I don't know, other Sylvanas, like, who knows, right? Yeah. And then you have one of your top Priest cards, which happens to come out on turn 3, the Dark Cultist, is a Death Rattle card. And your bad Death Rattle cards are few and far between, right? You're, like, Death Lords, you're, like, Dancing Swords. The biggest issue you're going to get is with things like Leper Gnome, right? Where it's not a bad card, it's just 1 mana, it's not what you want to do.
Yep.
But you have a huge chance of getting a very good card. Piloted Shredders, like...
Yeah, both of the piloted minions, piloted Sky Golem, piloted Shredders, and now you can even discover Wobbling Runs. So new card into new card.
And like we said, Wobbling Runs is pretty good for Priest, actually, right?
Yeah, it's not bad at all.
So I have this card very high on my list. Just a very good card, I think. The problem, of course, is that as Priest, you're always like kind of iffy about finding a way to squeeze out 2 mana on any turn. But later in the game, it's guaranteed just a very good card.
Yeah, so we've talked about this before, and while Priest as a class has gotten good value cards here, I still believe that Priest needs a card or a few cards to really beef up its early game, to basically solidify its early game in order for
another
Priest
Dark Cultist.
Well, Dark Cultist was great. Dark Cultist was something that was like the first step, but we've kind of addressed this before, and it needs something like Paladin where it has Shield of Mini and Muster, right? So super strong turn 2, super strong turn 3. And I'm not saying
things like that. I don't want... Blizzard could be listening.
But basically, a class that kind of relies on buffs, that relies on minions on the board to interact with, which is kind of the similarity between Paladin and Priest. It needs early on ways to establish the board. And Priest, Museum Curator, while you're going to draw a great value card, it's minus Temple on turn 2. Entomb, which came out last week, while it is a premium removal, it is a slow removal on turn 6. So just talking about the Priest once again, Museum Curator, super value, but at the same time, it's not a 2-drop. Really.
Yeah. Not at all. It's not a 2-drop at all.
Exactly.
It's a card you squeeze in later on, and then you play the actual card that comes out way later.
Right.
Which is why all those 1-drops are not considered good, right? Like, even Zombie Chow. You don't want a Zombie Chow from this guy. Like, normally
Yeah.
it's a great card, but it's awful if you get it in the late game.
Yep.
And yeah, we were playing a warrior deck last night, right? Like, totally off stream, and it had 2 obsidian destroyers, and we faced a priest who literally entombed both obsidian destroyers, which is a
Yes.
great answer to a great card. But that priest lost because it didn't do anything. It didn't change the fact that we had the board and we were dealing 4 or 5 damage to his face every turn, and he's using up all his mana just to entomb our stuff.
Yep. So we'll see. And this is something now that we've seen all of these cards, and even with the bonus, I don't anticipate priests being that much better just because they haven't gotten faster in the early game or more solid in the early game. But this is something that we can leave for next expansion. Not every class is going to be OP, and we have yet to see how the 25% LOE bonus is going to affect the meta. So we'll leave it.
I'm so excited for the warrior.
No, that was fun. We played a warrior run last night.
That's the run I was talking about.
Yeah.
That was just a ridiculous run. We don't talk a lot about random runs we do, especially we don't do that many runs off stream these days. But it had a variant, which is what made it great. Variant won us 0 games.
All right. Should we go on to the next card?
Yeah, Raven Idol, which is a druid card, common class card, and it's very interesting. It's a spell, and it has a choose one that's discover a minion or discover a spell. So what happens is you play the card, you get your 2 choices that come up on screen. One is like a 0 mana spell that says discover a minion, and the other is a 0 mana spell that says discover a spell, and then you pick it, and then you discover your spell or your minion. Now, the easiest way to look at this is kind of like tracking, except you tracking once, right?
Yeah.
Like, rather than so we had talked about this before in terms of the discover mechanic, which is that in tracking you have already had a selection of 3 cards and you pick one, and then of those cards that got picked, you get to track among 3 of them. And so the card quality is really high. Here, you don't get that option. You just get 3 random cards, and then you get to track one of them. So it's not as high of card quality. But on the bright side, you get to pick of whether it is a minion or a spell. And that could really make a big difference.
Yeah, it really can. And I think that's a good analysis. So you want this double filter, right? And the filter is...
Sorry.
You okay, man? All right. So as we were saying, it's a double filter. Normal discover cards only have a single filter where it's almost as if you're going back to the draft and you're picking a card, right? But with tracking, you have this double filter where you filter first in the draft and then you filter again once you track. And that's why tracking is better than a normal discover mechanic because, just a discover mechanic that is not limited, right? We have very specific discover mechanics for some cards. But so that's why tracking is typically better than discover. Here you have another filter. And once again, I think very good card design by Blizzard. It introduces another skill aspect in which you have to assess the situation and say, well, do I need a minion or do I need a spell? What are my chances? What are druid spells? Like, what's the % chance that I'll grab a good spell for this situation? So it introduces skill, it introduces this double filter, and it introduces controlled good RNG, right? And it's a fun card that increases the flexibility of druids, which just goes down that pathway of druids being the most flexible kind of mid-range class in the arena.
Yep. It's definitely going to be more of an expert kind of card that good players will use better. Because you have to anti-tempo yourself to use this or to use tracking, right? You just spend 1 mana, you don't get anything on the board.
Yeah.
That's Raven Idol. Overall, is it better than a tracking? Is it worse than a tracking? I think it depends. One of the things about Discover is that the average card you discover, even if you don't have this filter of a minion or a spell, it is going to be higher in value than the average card that you get offered in your draft, because Discover discovers all cards kind of evenly with a with an additional, like, I think it was 4x or 5x factor for class cards. And that's very, very important. We were talking about the Discover mechanic for Museum Curator for Priest and Dark Cultist in there, which is very good. But for Druid, imagine you're discovering a spell and it's going to just be a Druid spell for the most part.
Yeah.
Druids have some pretty powerful spells. And also minions. Druids have some pretty powerful minions. It's a very kind of like meat and potatoes kind of class. So all of its stuff is going to be pretty good. And you're going to get a disproportionately good chance of getting them when you use this. So it's not as good as a tracking in terms of it doesn't have the double filter. But because of how Discovery works, and because of how you can pick to discover a spell if you're like ahead on the board, or if you don't like, if you're not in desperate need of a minion, and the additional access to like legendary minions and all that stuff, I think it's as good as a tracking, if not better.
Yep, agreed. And plus, it would just be a fun card, and we could always use a couple more of those in the arena.
Yep. All right, now we're moving on to the Hunter common, which is one of the reasons why, and this will come in immediately, all these cards will come in with a 25% offering bonus, and it is one of the reasons why Hunters will suck even more. And if you're not good with Hunter now, this is not the time to come back. It is a 3-mana card, it's a Desert Camel, and I love camels, so I'm kind of disappointed that this card is so bad. It is a 3-mana card, and it is a 2/4, and its battle cry is put a 1-cost minion from each deck into the battlefield.
Yeah.
So, if you have a 1-cost card and your opponent doesn't, it's very good for you. On the other hand, if your opponent has a 1-cost minion and you don't, it's very bad for you. For the most part, you're probably both putting a 1-cost minion out onto the battlefield, and then it's just not good because your opponent gets to use his 1-cost minion before you do, unless you can remove that on the board, which means you need 1 extra attack. And unlike, you're a hunter, it's not even like you have a hero power that can remove a 1-mana minion.
Yeah, so with this one, there are definitely some considerations. Number one, the Desert Camel is a 2/4 beast, and it's so 4 health is pretty essential on turn 3 because it can curve out well into turn 4 Houndmaster. The fact that it is a Hunter card means that if you play Hunter aggressively, and my belief is that you should try to play Hunter aggressively, you will probably have more 1-drops than your opponent. So more often, although not significantly more often, but more often, you will pull a 1-drop, and then your opponent has less of a chance to pull a 1-drop. But yeah, at the same time, if they do get the 1-drop, that 1-drop has initiative. Yours does not. And at the same time, you're putting down kind of a pretty weak body in turn 3, which is just a 2/4. So,
and as the Hunter, right? Like, even if you do have the initiative, let's say you have a bunch of stuff on the board and you can be the first person to act on that 1-drop that comes out, the last thing you want to do as a Hunter is not hit the opponent's face.
Exactly. Yeah. You don't want to push damage into a dumb little 1-drop. No. And if you pull a 1-drop and your opponent doesn't, I mean, that's huge. That's fantastic, just because you've eliminated a small card in your deck, so you won't be top decking a 1-drop. So that's fantastic. And you get extra value. You get a beast and a 2/4 plus something else. That's a better Razorfen Hunter, and Razorfen Hunter is a pretty decent card, especially for Hunter. So this is not that bad if you get the bonus and your opponent doesn't, but that's not going to happen that often.
Yeah. So it really, it depends kind of on your deck, but these days most decks have a couple of 1-drops, so your opponent will have it. All right, Cursed Blade, double all damage. Okay, so this is a weapon. It is the 3rd warrior card that's making the warrior arena come back. It's a rare card. It's a weapon, and it reads double all damage dealt to your hero, which means as long as your weapon is equipped, yes, your hero is taking double damage, not just from the weapon, but from any source. Like if your opponent hits you, it deals double. Now, the weapon itself is a 1-mana weapon that's a 2/3. Now, That should remind you of a Stormforge Axe, which is 2 mana with Overload 1, so it's like 2.5, 2.6 kind of mana in total. This is only 1 mana, so it's very good for tempo. On the downside, it's very bad for your face damage. And it's so bad for your face damage that you will want to swing this for your opponent's face on every turn if you're not removing something off the board.
Yeah. And that's the problem with this weapon, right? You can gain some tempo in the beginning, but because you're the warrior and your game plan has to revolve around weapons, if you are if your game plan doesn't involve a couple of fiery war axes or death spite or arcanite reapers in addition to the curse blade, you probably don't have a winning deck. So if you use the curse blade and suddenly by turn 4 you're already down to 15 HP, you run into this issue of, well, I have all these other weapons, but I'm probably just going to die if I try to use them for value. So this is really good value in one way, but it kind of prevents you from getting the super value that you want from your other weapons, which is really what's holding it back. So part of the reason why Stormforge Axe is really good is just because it comes out on an appropriate turn. Lots of times the difference between 2 drops and 3 drops with the axe equipped is negligible. So it just really fits into the scheme
and you get to hold it, right? Yeah. Like you don't get to hold this. You're not going to get as much value out of this as a Stormforge Axe because you have to throw it away very quickly. One, because you're going to die otherwise, and two, just because you have other weapons, right? Like you can't even play your Arathi weaponsmith with this card in hand, or at least you don't want to. With this card equipped. Now, actual opinions on this card is kind of all over the place. Like some people think it's pretty much unplayable. It's like Ogre Warmaul, if not worse. Other people think it's like the next coming of a Coghammer. Overall, it's still a good card. It's definitely an above average card because you are in one of two positions as the warrior. You're always in one of two positions. If you get it in the very early going, it's a 1 mana card, and that in and of itself is good enough. Now, like Merp says, it does set you on the path of, okay, my later weapons that I'm going to get are going to go face. Yeah. But that's not a bad thing, because with this Cursed Blade, you've already cheated so much mana in the beginning of the game when there's so few mana relatively available. Yes. So if you curve out, you're guaranteed the board. Like, and not just a little bit of the board, but so much of the board. You are just there. And if you can't turn that into some face damage to your opponent to end the game, especially if you have an Arcanite Reaper following that up, which is a Pyroblast at the face over 2 turns, well then something was iffy with your deck. So getting this early is very good. Now getting this late, you have 2 choices, right? You either don't have the board, in which case this is a dead card. As soon as you equip it, your opponent hits your face, you're dead.
Yes.
Or you do have the board, in which case it's kind of the late game. You can kind of armor up a little bit, and you can still kind of get some use out of it, right? And if you have the board, your opponent's hitting your face less, if you're just focused on kind of controlling the board. So it's not a good card at that point, but it's hardly a dead card. Now, of course, it does also put you in deeper range of lethal, right? Like, you equip this, your opponent fireballs you for 12 damage now. So there's a lot of considerations to be made, but when you have your reads and you have your stuff, this is not a totally dead card in the late game. I'd say like half the time, especially if you're up. But if you're down, it's not helping you come back. And the flip side is, well, if you're a warrior and you're down, what is helping you come back?
Yeah, it's...
like nothing.
Nothing, basically, and that's part of the weakness of warrior, right? You basically need a huge execute turn, right? That's basically the only kind of tempo cheat that the warrior has. A good execute will bring you back into the game, but it's not going to be weapons based, really, because weapons will just kind of accelerate your death. I think we're in agreement here about Cursed Blade. My opinion is that it's not terrible. It's not good, you know, it's not a very good card. I think it's around, for me, it's around average. I like the point you brought up about being able to kind of cheat a little bit of mana in the beginning, but that 1 mana is very significant. If you just look at it, how many times have your opponent dropped a zombie chow in turn 1 and just like, well, okay, my game is over. That's GG. Drop the zombie chow, it's done. And if you think about it, if you just look at the progression of what the stat distribution should be like, it should be 3 total stats on turn 1. So it should be a 1/2 or a 2/1. Zombie Chow adds +2 stats. So
Well,
that is
kind of. You could also be a 1/3 with an ability.
sure. I mean, but that's class. Like class cards do weird things, right? Or you could be Sir Finley and you could be a legendary, but whatever. So it's basically adding +1/+1, which is 1 mana. So you're cheating just 1 mana on turn 1, but it's huge because you're basically increasing it by 100%. You're getting more. So imagine on turn 4, instead of getting a 4 mana minion, you're increasing that by 100% and getting an 8 mana minion.
Yep.
That's ridiculous. That's You should think about it in that way. It's not just I get an additional 1 mana. You're getting double the amount you should be getting that turn. So that's why something like a Zombie Chow is that good. And Curse Blade.
And it's why the coin is that good in the beginning, and it's why the coin sucks later on. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's relative to your current position. So by coining out on turn 1, you're getting double the mana for that turn. If you're on turn 2 and you coin out 3, you're getting an additional 50%. So it's all relative to your turn. And Curse Blade in the beginning of the game has that kind of effect, but once again, because you're the warrior, like later on, it gets very awkward because you still want to use weapons.
And the chances of you having it in your opening hand is very low compared to the chances of you top decking it later. That's the main problem with this card.
Yeah.
All right, going to the Warlock. It is the next card is a.
I'm sorry, go on.
Okay, so this card is not going to be good by Merps' reaction. It is a warlock spell that is a common, and it is meant to make warlocks a little bit worse and to dilute their pool of cards. It is 2 mana. It's the Curse of Rafam, Rafaam, and it reads, give your opponent a quote-unquote cursed ! Card. While they hold it, they take 2 damage on their turn. So it'll deal 2 damage immediately when your opponent's turn starts, and then for each turn they don't get rid of it, it'll deal 2 more damage.
See, here's the thing. When I first saw this card, and I didn't see the curse card, I was like, okay, so you pay 2 mana, you give them an immediate 2 damage, you put a card in their hand, and I was thinking, oh, so how much does this curse card cost? I'm like, is it 3 mana? I'm like, maybe. I'm like, well, 4 mana might be a little bit too powerful. I'm like, yeah, it's probably 3. It never occurred in my mind that it would be the exact same mana cost. The cursed card costs 2 mana, and you basically pay 2 mana and deal 2 damage to your opponent's face, and it's only just their face. And there's some interaction.
Hunter hero power.
Yeah, I know. More cards, less cards in their hand, but you're basically saying, hey, look, if you want to undo this, you can pay 2 mana. However, I'm not even forcing you to use this next turn.
Yes.
You can use it however you want. And, you can say, is it good to have an extra card in your hand? Is it bad to have an extra card in your hand? These are kind of constructed questions. It's very, you're not going to really see that impact in Arena, right? Like Mountain Giant, Clockwork Giant, the closest thing you're going to get is maybe like Goblin Sapper or something, maybe a Twilight Drake. That is probably the most relevant, but the card itself is not the big thing. It's such a weak effect. It doesn't kind of punish your opponent's tempo, and you give them the option of when they want to get rid of it. If they don't want to get rid of it the next turn because they want to play out their entire mana and just gain the advantage on the board, they'll do that, and they'll take an extra 2 damage. It's like, whoop-de-doop, I took 2 damage. That's it.
All right. So, I mean, I think you're analyzing this too much. It's a card that deals damage to your opponent. How good is Sinister Strike? How good is Mind Blast? How good is that rogue card that you get back? What's that one?
Yeah. Oh, Head Crack.
Head Crack. How good is Head Crack? Yeah, they're not good. They're not good cards in the Arena. So this is that, but even worse because it's effectively a 0 mana card that deals 2 damage. So I mean, are you really that desperate for mana? Is your opponent really that desperate for mana that they can't just pay the 2 mana after you've anti-temp with yourself? Its real use in theory is if you're playing a super aggro deck and then you play this card and your opponent needs to Consecrate or Holy Nova or whatever, they're going to do it anyway and then just take more damage from this curse card, and you like fill up the next turn, right? You basically keep putting your opponent in a position where they can't get rid of this card, then you like loath them or whatever, right? But even then, this is like a really slow kind of like effect.
Yep.
And it's just like it's disruptive to your opponent. It's kind of interesting, but in the arena, it's just it starts off on a bad basis of cards that deal direct face damage and do nothing else, and then it has the downside of being a bad version of a card that does that.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about a card that maybe people will actually see and play in the arena.
Sure, sounds good.
Animated Armor, Mage card, rare, class card, 4/4 for 4 mana. The ability is your hero can only take 1 damage at a time. So stops face going to the face, which is kind of like a taunt, but doesn't fully stop it. Your opponent can still deal 1 damage to you with each target. We'll just start with 4/4 for 4 mana is a pretty good card, but is below average. You always want the better 4 drops. And the ability is worth something, but it's not worth a ton. Because your opponent generally wants to trade anyway. And a 4/4 is often able to be like eaten by any of your opponent's bigger cards.
Right.
So it kind of taunts 4 damage. Without actually changing how the tempo works on the board, because your opponent can attack other minions through it and all that. So, now 4/4 for 4 is not that bad to begin with. You add an extra ability, it's pretty good. So it's almost like average-ish. I don't
know. So the problem you have with this is Arena is all about the board control. It's very tough to play from behind when you don't have the board. Mages are a little bit different. And I think it is very interesting that they made this a mage card. And ADWCTA, we talked about this kind of before the podcast. And I think you brought up an interesting point in that mages, a lot of the times, they're very predictable in that. So sometimes if they were lucky enough to draft it, they could have a turn 6 Blizzard. But a lot of the times you expect the turn 7 Flame Strike. Now, how do you counter the turn 7 Flame Strike? You set up your board, you take advantage of the fact that Mage doesn't exactly have the fastest early game, and you just go face. You pressure them and say, after you Flame Strike, you're down to like 5 HP, and I just kill you right after that.
Yep.
This card, while it is understated, which is not the best thing, because you should be getting 1 more health or 1 more attack, it can force your opponent to do a little bit of something, like remove it when they might not want to. As opposed to just a normal 4 mana 4/4, which, let's face it, would be pretty bad. And it just can help you kind of limp and get to turn 6 or turn 7, in which you can start flame striking, blizzarding, and make a comeback. So it's not a great card by any means. I think it's kind of slightly above average for me. I think you like it a little bit more than that, but it does have a role in Mage.
I don't think it's even like above average. I think it's kind of just average-ish.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Because going by kind of our tier list scores, a 50 is average, right? And I think it's like maybe a little bit higher than that. That's about it. So with this card, I think it does have a purpose in that because mages have all of these AoEs, you're able to stall a little bit more until you can get to your massive AoEs and potentially just win off card advantage from those later turns. But because it's the arena as well, stats are usually more important than synergy, usually more important than anything else, and the lack of 1 stat point can really make a difference.
Yep. All right, so let's move on to the last class card we're talking about here, Tomb Pillager. It's a rogue card, it's common, and I'm going to throw this to you after I describe the card. It is a 4 mana 5/4, so normally statted, and it has a death rattle that says, add a coin to your hand.
Yep. So you guys should know how much I love rogues in today's meta. ADWCTA and I have always thought that rogue was the number one class in the TGT meta. Um, and this card is a little bit different. So what we saw in TGT were a lot of fast cards. Buccaneer, Understudy Valiant, and we saw Pit Snake last week, which is another fast card that really plays into the rogue strategy of tempoing and trying to put your opponent in bad situations, right? This card is much slower. It is basically like a Lost Tall Strider, and the Death Rattle is add a coin to your hand, and we all know how much rogues love coin. The only problem is you're gonna have the coin on turn 5 at the earliest, and that's kind of when the coin doesn't do as much. Coin on turn 2, coin on turn 3, huge payoff, right? You can do a lot of things like coin on turn 3. You can do like coin Understudy Valiant plus a Goblin Auto Barber to buff up your dagger and then kill something. The coin starts becoming less relevant at that point, but it still plays into this sort of strategy that the rogues have of having a good combo activator, of once again being able to tempo out a little bit harder, because you get the coin in your hand and you basically, on the macro level, you are cheating a little bit of mana, you're cheating a little bit of tempo. Yep. So if you want to kind of put the cost into the Tomb Pillager, you're paying a little bit less than 4 mana for a 5/4, which is really good.
Yep, that's pretty much what it is. It's better than a 5/4. It's not amazing.
No.
Don't look at this as a 3 mana 5/4 in any way, shape, or form.
No.
But it's an above average card.
I would say it's like a 3.7 mana for a 5/4, but you can't pay the 3.7 mana, obviously. So.
And then you look at what it does though to the rogue. This is what I find really interesting. And the other cards we talked about, right? Like the priest has a 2 mana card that draws you a card, makes you even slower. The druid gets a card that makes it even more flexible. The hunter gets a card that makes it focus more on 1-drops. As crappy of a card it is, it's at least a beast. The camel is a beast, and it's been more beneficial for you to have 1-drops. The Cursed Blade is a way for the warrior to get super tempo in the early game, which is what the warrior kind of lives on because it doesn't do much else afterwards. And then I don't know, the Warlock's card is not a card, and the Mage's card helps you prevent being dealt lethal, which helps you survive, which goes with the Mage theme of like freezing and your hero power doesn't deal damage to you and all that stuff. Now you get to the Rogue, and you have this mid-sized body.
Yep.
That, yes, coin is a very rogue kind of concept, but not really at this stage. At the stage in which you can get a coin here. And
it's
so
a well-designed card for that reason.
It's a well-designed card in terms of balance, but I don't know if it's a well-designed card in terms of flavor. Like, on the bright side, it's better than that. It's better than that 3/4 for 3 mana for the Rogue, right? Like, I have a huge problem with that card because I don't think Rogue should have a 3 mana 3/4 card. That's not what Rogues do. They shouldn't have a beefy minion. None of their minions are beefy minions for their cost. Even their 2-drop, which is the Goblin Auto Barber and the Defias, are either split stats for 2 minions, which makes it more aggro, or a 3/2, not a 2/3. So at least the Tomb Pillager here is fitting that like 5/4 model rather than 4/5. So I have more of a problem with how the Raptor was done than the Tomb Pillager. But still, it's a sizable minion, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how much I like these kind of sizable minions for the Rogue. At least the stat distribution is what I think is a more rogue-like stat distribution.
Yeah, I think the fact that it is a rogue-like distribution of 5/4 instead of 4/5 makes it justifiable. And because it is just a fat drop, it's not even a fat drop. It's just like a bigger drop, right? It's your stereotypical kind of like mid-game minion. I think it's fine because it doesn't increase the power of rogues that much. If they were to give rogues kind of another Buccaneer, right? Another Buccaneer, another Undercity Valiant, and just kept on pushing its early game into as strong as possible, while it would keep on going down this path that rogues go down, I think it's always a danger to increase the power of a class's early game, right? That's really dangerous. Increasing the power of its late game is safe. Like we see that with Obsidian Destroyer, which is a great card, but it's still a late game card. So the impact, the first question that we asked when we saw Obsidian Destroyer was, well, can warriors make it there?
Yep.
Like the fact that it's on turn 7, you still have to make it there. So with Tomb Pillager, rogues are going to make it to turn 4, and they can profit off of this card. But because it's not like an Undercity Valiant, it's not like a Buccaneer, I think it is okay.
Right. I'm just speaking more from a flavor perspective. Like
Gotcha.
with the Warrior and the Obsidian Destroyer, it added a whole new dimension to Warrior, right? Like it was meant to change the flavor of Warrior. Blizzard's been pushing the change in the flavor of the Warrior to more taunt minions, and now with the Obsidian Destroyer to give them a big late game option. It was a big change. And I liked that because I thought the Warrior needed a change in terms of the direction that it could go. And Blizzard was at the same time taking away the charge function from the Warrior. So Warrior's in the middle of a little redesign here. Rogue's not really in the middle of a redesign. It's just eating into the space of, like, what more mid-rangey minion can you make than a 4-mana card, right? Like, that's not the Rogue space. Like, 3-4 mana, that's kind of the mid-range place. And so I guess they kind of had to design a card for this. Maybe they just thought Rogue needed a 4-mana common card, but they already had one. It was the Anubar Ambusher, and it was a great card. And it played with, like, the Rogue's mechanic while being overstatted, while having a downside. Like, it was an interesting card. This card is just not interesting enough, in my opinion, to really fit into the Rogue and what the Rogue is doing for such a normal distribution of stats.
Right. Because I think the coin with the Rogue always makes it interesting, right? And with the Rogue...
Not when it's that late. Like, what are you coining?
I don't know. But right now they have one way to gain a coin, which is Cut Purse, which is a smaller way. And here it's a more guaranteed way. So we'll see. I think that maybe we could be potentially underrating the flavor of it. But that's not really for an arena talk, right?
Yep. All right, let's talk about the 2 legendary cards now. We're getting 2 legendaries in this wing, and it is Elise Starseeker and Archthief Rafam. Which I guess is related to the curse that he puts on you.
How is he so powerful with such a bad curse?
Well, let's see how powerful he is. Let's start with him, and then we'll go to Elite Starseeker afterwards.
Sure.
The Archthief Rafam is a 9-mana card. Finally, a big legendary after so many tiny, tiny legendaries that have come before this in LOE. But it's only 7-8 in stats. 7-8 normally would be a 7-mana minion. So what are these 2 mana being used for in terms of the card valuation? Well, it has a battle cry that says, discover a powerful artifact. What are artifacts? Artifacts are new cards. They're special cards just for this Rafam guy. And I'm going to try to find all of them for you guys right now. Okay, artifacts are all spells. And they're all 10 mana. So not only do you have to pay 9 mana for Rafam, but the turn after you probably want to use the artifacts. And the 3 artifacts are that you will get one on random. You will get a choice of which one.
Yes,
right?
You got a choice.
It's discover. So you get to pick whichever one you want. First one is Mirror of Doom. Fill your board with 3/3 mummy zombies.
Not bad.
Which is pretty good, but very kind of reactive. Your opponent can just hit your face. They can remove all the zombies with a flame strike. There's a lot of ways this could go wrong.
Yes.
The one after that is Timepiece of Horror, which is deal 10 damage randomly split among all enemies, which is awful for 10 mana.
It is a worse Avenging Wrath. Yes.
Just totally awful to take your whole turn to do that. It really is more like a Pyroblast, right? Where what you're trying to aim for when you do something like this is that, my opponent doesn't have a lot. I'm just trying to end the game right now.
Yes.
And then the third one, like, it's not a bad thing, right? Like, if you look at something like Nourish, where you have a card and you have 2 things you can pick. One is draw 3 cards, really good. The other one is gain 2 mana crystals on turn 5. Not good. But you still use the gain 2 crystals at some times. I use it probably 10-15% of the time. Most people use it a little less than that. But there are cases where it's just the right choice because of the unique situation you find yourself in. So it's not a worthless card to have the option of picking. And the third one is, again, also 10 mana. It is a Lantern of Power. Give a minion +10/+10. So what all of these cards have in common is that they're generally a bit anti-tempo. Like, you expect a card with this kind of ability to cost a little bit less, like maybe like 8 mana or something like that. But they cost 10 mana. So you spend 2 mana on the Rafam guy to draw a card, and then you have to spend even more mana to play this card that's all anti-tempo. Now, on the bright side, these cards are really freaking powerful, right?
Yep.
And so they're just meant to end the game right there if you could play it on a good situation. So I don't know. I think it's really interesting. It's hard to value.
Yeah, so I think the appropriate comparison to this card would be Nefarian, right? Same mana cost. The body is a little bit weaker. You're paying 9 mana. Nefarian is a 9 mana 8/8 minion, and you grab 2 random spells from your opponent's class.
But the spells would not be overcosted.
No, they're not overcosted. Over here, you have a 9 mana 7/8, so the body is a little bit less powerful. You get these, but you get a choice of something that you are, that you could use next turn, or you don't have to. And the spells are basically overcosted for what they do. Not really Mirror of Doom. Mirror of Doom is the one that is actually really good in terms of cost versus what you get out of it, like stat-wise. But once again, it is very vulnerable to your opponent just killing you or removing it with kind of a inexpensive AOE.
Yeah.
So I think a good comparison is Nefarian. Which do you think is better, Nefarian or this guy?
Nefarian by a long shot.
By a long shot.
I think Nefarian it gives you 2 well-costed cards, and you can play those cards, and you don't have to play those cards. These cards are totally all in, right?
Yeah, they are
10
very
mana.
all in.
You skip your turn, and it has no flexibility. It means whichever card you pick, and remember, you don't get to pick the cards when you want to actually play it. You have to pick the card 1 turn before when you want to play it, or later, right? You pick something that's +10/+10 to a minion on the board. You say, oh, I have a big board with minions or whatever. Your opponent removes it all, or like removes all of them and then taunts up something, right?
Right.
Well, now your +10/+10 is kind of crappy, right? You make your 1 remaining minion +10/+10. You run it into your opponent's small taunt or a Noyotron or something. Like, what are you going to do? You can't do anything else with the rest of that turn is the problem, because you've used up all your mana. So you are very much locking yourself into a particular play. And that is incredibly bad when on these turns like 10, 11, 12 or whatever, you should have so much flexibility in your play. Nefarian gives you flexibility in that play.
You are. The interesting thing I see about this card is the potential mind games that you can play with your opponent. Because the mind game I see is between Lantern of Power versus Mirror of Doom, right?
Mm-hmm.
You put this out there, and you go into this...
Lantern of Power is the +10/+10 to a minion.
Yes.
Mirror of Doom is 3/3 minions all over your board.
Yeah. So you get into this, like, which one did he pick? Which one does he thinks that I think he picked?
Yep.
Because if you pick the Lantern of Power and you're just going to say, you think that I picked Mirror of Doom because it is of the better card, right? Just a better card. I'm going to pick Lantern of Power and force you to remove Archthief Rafam. And then if you don't remove it, then it's 17 damage on 1 turn at the very minimum. And I can just win like that. Or if I pick Mirror of Doom and you're like, oh man, I can't chance the Lantern of Power killing me in 1 turn, then you have to push a lot of things into Archthief Rafam, and then you reload with Mirror of Doom, and then you're like,
well, you're assuming you have other stuff on the board when you play Archthief Rafam now.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, that's a condition that's difficult to fulfill, right?
It is.
Because if you're basically, you have to have something on the board, and your opponent has to not have enough stuff on the board or in his hand to remove your stuff when you only play 1 giant minion. That's a pretty hard precondition to fill.
Yeah, but I do like this dynamic between these cards and kind of the situation that you can put your opponents in. Because it's impossible for your opponents to actually play around the stuff you get from Nefarian, right? It is just sort of, who knows what you can get. You can get double Blade Flurry from a rogue as a non-weapon class, and you just can't do anything. You could also just get 2, double Fireball from a mage as well and just end the game right there. With this, they're not really sure, and there's definitely mind games involved, and they potentially, because they know the cards, they could also make a mistake because you can say like, well, do they think I took the Mirror of Doom? Do they think I took the Lantern of Power? So I think it's a very fun card.
It's a fun card. In any case, it's going to be one of the most card advantage cards in the whole game, right?
Yeah.
You have a 7 mana body, and then you get a 8 mana worth of like stats of cards.
Yeah. But with this one, I don't think it's that far away from Nefarian. I think it's right around there. I don't think it's better than Nefarian. I would put it at about the same. You think it's much lower than that, right?
Yeah.
So this is something in which look out for our tier list update coming on Thursday, and you'll see who wins this epic debate between myself and ADWCTA. But I think this is a card that we are maybe a little bit more far apart at than the other cards that we've reviewed so far.
Mm-hmm. And the last and final card, legendary Elite Starseeker. It's a 4 mana 3/5, which is totally cool stat distribution. And then it has a battle cry that says, shuffle the map to the golden monkey into your deck. The map to the golden monkey is a 2 mana card that does nothing. It says, shuffle the golden monkey into your deck, draw a card. So you just lose 2 mana by playing this card whenever you do. And then, if you happen to also then draw the golden monkey, you get a 4 mana 6/6 taunt, which is pretty good. You get your 2 mana back and then some. And then the battle cry is replace your entire hand and deck with legendary minions, which
is not great, but if you're
I think it's really good because at that point it's so late in the game that you just want big stuff, and legendary minions are heavily disproportionately big stuff.
Just drop a rag and then and then try to win from there. Drop a Tyrion and just be like, okay, well, all right. So the best thing about this card is that a 4 mana 3/5. We play those cards all the time, right?
Yep.
It's a little bit understated, but a 4 mana 3/5 is not the worst body. I could see this card getting picked in the arena, not because it's great, but just because it's the best available. You know, you get this, you get Baron Rivendell, and you get a very so-so card, and you're going to pick this, and you're never going to get the Golden Monkey, or
that's something you should really like highlight. You're never going to get the Golden Monkey.
Right. The chances are just. Look, it should just be Elite Starseeker, Battle Cry, have a negligible chance to appear on Trollden. That's it. That's all it is.
And so what I'm trying to say is that its Battle Cry is actually a negative.
It is.
Because the first card you draw is a 2 mana card that you need to cycle. So that can actually screw you over. The third card you draw will only kind of make up, maybe, but you've already spent the 2 mana so far ahead of time that unless you draw it really quickly, it's not even going to make up for the card that you've lost, for the 2 mana that you've lost earlier on. And if you don't want to lose the 2 mana, well, now you have a card that you can't use that's a dead card in your hand. So it's just really a disruptive card. And on the bright side, it's not all that likely that you draw the map anyway, right? Like, we've all been playing with the LOE card, the 7/4 card. What's that called? Ancient Shade?
Ancient Shade.
We've all been playing with them. We've all seen other people play it. How often do you actually draw the curse, right? Like, that's a pretty good standard for you to be able to interpret the card, because that's also a 4 mana card.
Right. And then basically, and imagine after you draw the curse, you shuffle another curse into there and you have to draw into again to just get the monkey that you have to pay for again, and then you can pay for the legend. Yeah.
Boo, fun, boo.
I know. But so you can't just look at it as, oh, it's a 4 mana 3/5 with some upside. The downside, the immediate downside is much worse because you are drawing an absolute dud. A card that does nothing, that only anti-temples yourself, that steals a draw from you. So, so my analysis is just saying a 4 mana 3/5 body, okay, but the battle cry is really, really bad.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well,
right.
But the battle cry is not really, really bad. The first card you draw is really, really bad. The battle cry is okay because you're not going to draw it.
Yes, the likely effect.
The likely effect is really bad. On the bright side, the chance of the effects going to trigger is very low.
Yep.
Okay, so let's move on to question from the GOAT. We spent a lot of time on these Wing 4 cards. I think we're kind of I mean, I'm a little sad that we're not going to be able to do any more card previews after this for a while, because I had a lot of fun doing. I always have a lot of fun doing card previews and card evaluations. So that about wrapped it up, and now we're moving on to the rest of this podcast for a question from the GOAT. What do we got?
All right, so for all of you listeners out there, you guys know how serious we are about the arena, how much we try hard, but I want to ask you, ADWCTA, and I think I know the answer. Other than just typical try-hard arenas, what do you do to kind of have fun with it, to spice up your arenas, to do something a little bit different with them? You don't, do you? This is what I expected. Go on, please go on. Go on.
I sometimes I play different classes.
What a rebel, guys. Wow.
I sometimes pick cards that are not the best card if I haven't used it before, so that I can experiment with it.
Wow. ADWCTA didn't choose the Thug Life. The Thug Life chose him. This is what a daredevil. Anyways, this is honestly what I expected from ADWCTA. Boring old ADWCTA.
What do you do for fun?
Okay, so obviously I'm the more fun individual.
Oh yeah, obviously.
Obviously. But if you guys do watch our Twitch stream sometimes I'll do a draft in which you pick all lefts or all right. But my favorite aspect, because this introduces a bit of skill. So what you do
to pick all middle.
No, yes. Unlike all left or all right, all mid is pure skill. No, what I like is you do lock yourself into like all left or all right or all mid, but you get 5 or 6 mulligans or chances, so you have to, and for those 5 or 6 chances, you can say like, okay, for this pick, I am not picking the one that I am forced to pick, and I can pick something else. So with that, you actually have to play your percentages, you have to play your probabilities, and you say, okay, based on this deck so far, like when should I kind of dip into my reserve of choices? Is this card worth it, right? And how early, like if you keep on getting, if you just use your like 4 picks in the first 10, like your 4 mulligans in the first 10 picks, you're like, well, now I only have 2, and now if that like now if I get Dr. Boom after I've used up all my picks by turn 20, that really stinks, right? So I always thought that was fun. It's kind of cool. There's a lot of debate, and it's just a way to kind of spice up arenas other than try-harding and just trying to grab all the wins you can.
You should talk to Blizzard. It seems like a good idea to make a more casual version of Arena.
Yeah, this is good. And I also liked asking this question to establish the non-fun ADWCTA and how he hates having fun.
ADWCTA is amazingly fun when actually playing the game. Just don't see the need to handicap myself before I play the game.
Yeah. So ADWCTA is saying it's fun to win, right? It's just fun to win.
It's definitely fun to win. I think that's why a lot of us play the game. Oh. All right. We're moving on. If you're still around to listen to Merps rip on me for no reason at all, we're very thankful for our Patreon supporters. We just got the funds in from last month, and we're in the process of, we already paid for the computers that we're going to get, and we're waiting for them to ship. So thank you guys. And if you want to support the Lightforge podcast or our streams or YouTube videos or just anything we're doing for the Hearthstone Arena community, feel free to go to patreon.com/grinninggoat and become a Patreon.
Thanks for your support, guys.
We still don't have any sponsors yet, so as of now, this is the way we're getting. It usually takes people like half a year to get like a podcast, half a year to a year to really get some real sponsors. So we're still on track for that. All right, so let's move on to Card Good Bad. This one's actually really interesting. I'm excited that this is one of the things we're talking about. And we're doing Card Good Bad today. And Card Good Bad is where we tell you whether a card is good or bad.
Yes.
And today we're going to tell you whether the questing adventurer is good or bad.
Yes.
So Merps, questing adventurer,
I'm starting.
is
Okay.
it good or bad?
Ooh, once again, we really have moved away from the spirit of card good bad, and we're really lying to people now because I'm gonna say it's decent. It is deck dependent and decent. Quest Adventurer, just to recap, it is a 3 mana 2/2, and every time you play a card, any card at all, it gains +1/+1. So it is obviously understated, pretty heavily understated, because right now, if you look at kind of the standard bearer, that is a spider tank for 3 mana. So you're missing 3 stats, but you gain the upside there. So it is definitely not a typical 3 drop. You don't want to drop it on 3 because you're getting an underpowered 2 drop for 3 mana, which is never something that you want. But it does have potential to get out of hand, right? So you can either look at it as a win more card, or you can look at it as a potential swing card. So this is something that rogues typically do, that other classes aren't able to do. Just have one huge turn in that they maximize their ability to kind of like spend all these cards and gain combo advantages. Questing Adventure is kind of like a combo, right? It allows every class to be this rogue-ish, rogue-like, and playing lots of cards in one turn and gain more value than just the individual value of the cards that you play. So you can either use it as in that way as well. Now, as for whether it's good or bad, you can see in some situations in which you can, do this huge turn. Sometimes you can get a 4/4 or a 5/5, and if it survives, you can grow it to like an 8/8, and just gets out of control. And there are other times when you just drop it and you can maybe turn it into a 3/3, and then it just dies right away, and you're pretty sad
You always
about
turn it into a 3/3. You never just drop it as a 2/2 and leave it there.
No. In very small situations, would you just drop it as a 3/3?
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's why it is a very average card in my mind. There are good, there's upsides and there's a lot of downsides as well. And it is a card that I think is a very skillful card. It requires turn planning. It requires kind of seeing the vulnerabilities on the opponent's side of the board or the class, and just seeing what could happen to this engine that you have.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think I'm going to take a more pro-questing adventure perspective on this. I think it's a good card. I think it's, like, flat out a good card. It's not the best card. It's definitely not a 3-drop. But as far as a card that you can play in the late game goes, I am never upset to see questing adventure. Because you can always get it to be a 4/4. It's just 3 mana. When can you not find 2 small cards you eventually draw that you don't play before then? Especially when you have it in your hand and you're trying to, like, look for something like that. And then you get it to be, even in the worst case scenario, a 3/3 or a 4/4, for 3 mana, you now have a card that your opponent absolutely must remove. Your opponent will burn his Fireball on it, they will burn their Flame Lance on it, they will, if they have a minion, it's killing that guy. And that kind of control over the board and over your opponent's cards and over what your opponent's going to do is invaluable. You get to play the Puppet Master and you get to dictate what your opponent does. So even if this card never becomes 8/8 and wrecks your opponent, it's still gotten so much more value than you are normally able to get for 3 mana. And it's balanced because it's not going to get all that much value on turn 3. You can't play it on turn 3. It's not a 3-drop. So the turn flipping ability, the board flipping ability that Merps was talking about is real and it's serious, and it's one of those almost like Matter Bomber situations where there's just not a lot of cards in the game that do that. No one ever plays around it. You definitely can't play around a questing adventure. And so you can either catch your opponent unaware, right, where it's just an empty board, you play it, and your opponent is out of removals, and you just win the game. Or you force your opponent, you bait out that removal that you're afraid of because you want your Mookless champion to stay alive, or you want your whatever else to stay alive. And that makes it a very good card. People just have to never ever look at it as a 3-drop or a 4-drop or a 5-drop, really, unless you're desperate. It's a card coming out much later. But it can be good if it comes out much later. So a lot of people try to make it like in an aggro deck or something, and it doesn't work all that well. It's more of a mid-range deck kind of deal. So you have to be fighting enough for the board that you're reasonably on the board-ish, or you're at least fighting for it. So you can't play total control. And if you're total aggro, well, then this card is just, it's not going to get a lot of value because you'll be out of cards later on.
Yeah, good analysis. I think that's about all there is with Questing Adventure. It is a very nuanced card. It is very interesting. And I think it's a card that actually takes quite a lot of skill. You know, it's not skill as in use, in using the card. It's skill as in turn planning and really assessing the situation. Because if you're putting it out there, you're only putting it out there when you think you have a decent percent chance of protecting it or of just extracting maximum value out of it. And those require turn planning, and those require kind of board and opponent analysis. So
yeah, definitely. All right, so that's card good bad, Questing Adventure. Let's move on to our final topic of the day before we actually go and play the Hearthstone Arena. Class Talk Paladin. We're doing a Paladin run after this, and so we thought we'd talk a little bit about the Paladin and where it is in the meta. You wanna kick us off, Paladin? Obviously,
Sure.
good class.
So Paladin, the probably the most hated class in the arena, definitely in TGT. Although now everything is a little bit different. People are playing different classes. The meta is shifting, and people hate the Paladin because they think that it is easy to play and that is very annoying. Now, as for the easy to play, I think it is a very predictable class, definitely. And the reason why people think Paladin is annoying is just because you can't give them the board at all. You even give them a small 1/1, suddenly Blessing of Kings and Archon Protector, and they're right back into the game. And Paladins are very powerful because their buffs and their class cards synergize very well with neutral cards. Buffs work on everything, and Archon Protectors work on everything. And they also have ways to just flood the board and keep the board. Muster for Battle is really good because there's no way you're denying them the board after they flood with 1/1s. Murloc Knight also on turn 6 puts out a good amount of stats for turn 6 on average, and also splits it up into 3 people. So it's like a turn 6 Muster for Battle almost. And that's just really good for what the Paladin wants to do. Weaknesses for Paladin, there's not that many, but if you can deny them the board, a lot of times they can't do anything. So the Blessing of Kings, the Seal of Champion, it's pretty much useless in their hands, but you have to deny them the board first, and they have many ways to get on the board.
Yeah, the best way they get, this is why people always wonder why I don't play around Consecration. It's because the only way to play around Consecration generally is to play right into a sword. And if you get consecrated, you're fine because you set up again, right? It's like getting Flame Strike. You don't really care if you get Flame Strike, even if you lose a lot of cards. You're set up again, you have the board, especially against the Paladin, that's all that matters. But if you get sworded, well, now your opponent has the board because the Paladin has another sword. So regardless of what you do, you're 4 damage down when you're trying to do your setup. And so your opponent will get the board over the course of the next 2 turns if he gets a good sword on you. So that's the Paladin's comeback mechanism on the board. Shielded Minibot aside, and the Argent Protector play in the early going, they Seal Champs on turn 3. That's actually not. They actually don't have a good way of getting on the board in the early going compared to a lot of the other classes. And they definitely don't have a good way to get back on the board later on in the game if you keep clearing the board, with the exception of this sword and also Coghammer, right? Muster for Battle. But those are rare and then epic cards. In terms of common cards, it's really just the sword that you're kind of really worried about all the time. So that's something that I think playing against a Paladin is very important to keep in mind, and playing as the Paladin, it's also very important to keep in mind. If you can sword, that's how you get back on the board.
Good advice. If you have one of the best cards in the game, you should probably use it.
And don't save it for whatever, right? Unless you have other ways to get back on the board. You need the board, especially if your card. I see sometimes people playing stuff because they don't need to use the board, the sword, or they're afraid of playing a sword on turn 5, and burn a mana. But that's really the right move most of the time. You just play your sword because that's what gets you on the board when you have buffs. Because you need to be on the board to use any of your buffs.
Definitely.
All right. That's it for the Lightforge this week. We are going to have the Kriparian on our show next week, for real this time.
Hype. I'm
Hype.
excited. I'm
Yeah.
super excited about this.
And we're going to talk about LOE and the meta and a lot of things relating to where the meta is kind of settling at that point, because we would all have a little bit of time to have played the LOE meta. And like we said, the plus 25% bonus is going to make everything feel a lot more League of Explorers starting on Thursday. And we are very excited about it. So until next week, this is ADWCTA.
This is Merps. Thanks, guys. See ya.